The city of Alexandria during the 4th and early 5th century, and in fact Egypt in general, was arguably one of the most volatile places in the Roman Empire in terms of religion. During the late Roman period, from around 350 CE to around 420 CE, the city changed in character quite dramatically. There was a rapid move away from the classical Hellenic culture and beliefs of the time towards an enforced Christianity on the orders of the Christian Roman emperors. And so Greco-Roman temples and shrines gave way to churches and monasteries with black-robed monks and fanatical Christians patrolling the city, smashing any pagan shrines and other signs of pagan presence and heritage. John of Nikiu was a 7th century Coptic Egyptian Christian bishop and chronicler who describes the situation in the reign of Theodosius during the late 4th century as violence towards pagans and paganism increased. Quote, and in those days, the orthodox inhabitants of Alexandria were filled with zeal, and they collected a large quantity of wood and burned the place of the heathen philosophers. So, how did this turbulent situation come about? Let's take a look at what was happening in Alexandria during the 4th century, and in particular the opinions of the pagan Emperor Julian towards the Christians in the city as this destruction of pagan heritage began in earnest. Julian could perhaps see the way things were going, and he writes a powerful letter to the Christians there, haranguing them for their faithlessness to their pagan roots and their interest in this newfangled and aggressive cult, i.e. Christianity fashioned from the Jewish belief. By the way, in this video I'm using clips from the 2009 film Agora, a fact-based but fictionalized account directed by Alejandro Amenabar. It's a superb movie, and if anyone wants to know more about the tense and ugly situation that had developed in late 4th century, early 5th century Alexandria, I would really recommend this film. The movie stars Rachel Weisz as Hypatia, the famous pagan philosopher who was killed by a Christian mob, and Michael Lonsdale as Theon, Hypatia's philosopher father. It's a very well directed, well made, well acted and thought-provoking movie. On top of that, it's probably the only movie to actually cover events in Alexandria in late antiquity. The movie covers both the destruction of the Serapeum and the death of Hypatia, and has moving scenes of the religious fanaticism and violence that played out in this period of the city's history. So definitely a movie to be viewed if you haven't watched it already. But firstly, let's just do a very quick background into the history of the city of Alexandria and how it got into this volatile state. Well, the city was founded by Alexander the Great around 700 years earlier in 331 BCE, and by the Roman period it had become one of the most populous and well-regarded cities, with many great sites including the Mausoleum of Alexander, the Great Library, the Pharos Lighthouse, and numerous temples and shrines. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled the city, was founded by Ptolemy, one of the generals of Alexander. But the dynasty would end in 30 BCE when Augustus finally annexed the country, and Egypt then became definitively part of the Roman Empire, and later the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, up to the Islamic conquest of the country beginning in 639 CE. But while the city was pretty stable during its pagan era, massive cultural, religious and social changes occurred during the period between Constantine and the Islamic conquest and after. The pagan presence was still very strong around the middle of the 4th century, and there were superb temples in prominent places, including the magnificent and very famous Temple of Serapis, one of the great marvels of the Greco-Roman age, situated on a prominent mound in the southwest of the city. Ammianus Marcellinus, the 4th century Roman historian, left a description of the magnificence of the temple. Quote, there are besides in the city temples pompous with lofty roofs, conspicuous among them the Serapeum, which, though feeble words merely belittle it, yet it's so adorned with extensive columned halls, with almost breathing statues, and a great number of other works of art, that next to the Capitolium, with which revered Rome elevates herself to eternity, the whole world beholds nothing more magnificent. However, changes were in progress, and Christian emperors from Constantine onwards had begun legislating against paganism and began the aggressive conversion of the pagan population all around the empire, and the Alexandrian Christians and the Christian authorities and patriarchs of the city, which ran the city, showed even more religious fervour and zeal than anywhere else on this matter. From a demographic aspect, the population of the city was split up into four main sections in the 4th century. Firstly, there were the pagans, who still formed a substantial part of the population, but were on the decline due to the onslaught of Christianity and the anti-pagan policies of the Christian emperors. Secondly, there were the Catholics or Trinitarian Christians who followed the Nicene Creed agreed to by many bishops of the Church in 325 CE. And the Nicene Creed had, in a nutshell, elevated Jesus to the level of the divine and on equal footing to God the Father. Thirdly, there were the Arian Christians who were said to be in the majority at this time in Alexandria. Arianism was a different strand of Christianity, and its followers were disciples of the Egyptian preacher Arius, who had died recently in 336 CE. Arian Christians essentially believed Jesus was of a lesser stature than God the Father, and that rather than being eternal, there was a time when he was not in existence. In other words, he was a lesser being than God the Father. And the fourth main group in the city were the Jews, who also formed a substantial part of the population and were as disliked as the pagans by the Christians for not having accepted Jesus as their Messiah. Within the Christian community, there was no love lost between the Arians and the Catholics, both of them seeing the others as heretics, although they both naturally combined forces in mob fighting against the pagans and the Jews, and when they weren't fighting each other, that is. And this argument between Catholics and Arian Christians could be considered the first major schism between the Christians, although there were plenty of other Christian heresies also around at this time relating to whether the nature of Jesus was divine or not, and the miscellaneous other dogma. And this battle between these two factions would continue during the 4th century, with various emperors like Constantius and Valens themselves having Arian sympathies. So there we have it, a quite complex and quite volatile and combustible situation developing in Alexandria as the city approached the 5th century, with several religious communities all having a distinct dislike and hatred of each other. But what really accelerated the aggression against the pagans were the attitudes of the Christian patriarchs of the city, who took an active lead in the fight against paganism. So let's take a quick look at some of the more prominent patriarchs, as well as some of the other Christian elements in the forefront of suppressing paganism. Well, the first prominent patriarch of this period was a chap called Athanasius, who was the patriarch of the city on and off between 328 and 373 CE. And he was a Catholic or a Trinitarian who followed the Nicene Creed and was one of the strongest critics of Arian Christianity. In fact, he spent most of his life countering and attacking the Arians, as well as making the expected attacks on the pagans. The Emperor Constantius had him exiled from the city, and this policy was continued by the pagan Emperor Julian as well. Julian had a big dislike of Athanasius, as he did all Christian leaders. Around October of 362, he had written a letter to Ecdicius, prefect of Egypt, about Athanasius, calling him a clever rascal and ordering him to leave Alexandria. Quote, "By all the gods, there is nothing I should be so glad to see, or rather hear reported as achieved by you, as that Athanasius had been expelled beyond the frontiers of Egypt. Infamous man, he had the audacity to baptize Greek women of rank during my reign." Theodoret, the 5th century Christian theologian, too mentions Athanasius busying himself converting pagans, and that the pagan priests of the city themselves had complained to Julian of his energetic efforts to extinguish paganism, mentioning if Athanasius was allowed to continue to be patriarch, there would soon be no pagans left in the city to worship the gods. And perhaps this triggered Julian's response in banishing Athanasius. For a time, the Emperor Constantius installed George of Cappadocia as patriarch in his place. George was a fanatical Arian and was hated by the Catholic Christians, hated by Arians as well for his extreme views, and hated even more so by the pagans who he openly ridiculed. Ammianus Marcellinus, the Roman historian, describes his contempt for the Temple of the Genius in the city as he passed by it one day, and hinting that it should be destroyed. Quam Deus sepulchrum hoc stabit, meaning for how long will this sepulchre stand? George famously said, and perhaps inciting violence against the structure by his followers. In fact, he would be murdered by a pagan mob after he had desecrated pagan temples rediscovered in the desert and had their items displayed and ridiculed in the city in front of the Christian population. Another aggressive patriarch of the city was Theophilus. Edward Gibbon, author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, had very little respect for Theophilus and his war against paganism, calling him the, quote, perpetual enemy of peace and virtue, a bold, bad man whose hands were alternately polluted with gold and with blood. Theophilus, too, busied himself in attacking paganism. Socrates Scholasticus, the 5th century church historian, writes that Theophilus, quote, exerted himself to the utmost to expose the pagan mysteries to contempt. And Theophilus encouraged the more extreme sections of Christian society, like the monks and the Parabalani, to clamp down on pagan worship. Theophilus would be succeeded in due course by his nephew Cyril, who was, if anything, even more antagonistic against paganism. This Christian religious fervour in Egypt meant that the country led the way in the rise of extreme monasticism, as with the example of St. Anthony and others like St. Pachomius, who wandered around the desert. Various monasteries began springing up all around the desert, a movement that would essentially trigger the monastic trend in Europe during the following centuries. And though these men were intolerant towards the pagans and paganism, many were content to largely lock themselves up in their own monasteries and insulate themselves away from society in general, which they considered so sinful. More troublingly, especially for the pagans in Egypt and Alexandria, was the religious fervour and fanaticism of many Christian groups. Libanius, a chronicler of the time, talks of Christian monks, or as he describes them, quote, the black-robed tribe, unquote, going around burning any pagan temples and shrines that they came across. These Christian monks were nothing like the elegantly dressed pagan priests and Vestal virgins attending to the pagan temples. They rejected all conveniences and civilization and hygiene of the Greco-Roman world. Eunapius of Sardis, a pagan Greek of the 4th century, described these Christian monks as, quote, men in appearance but who led the lives of swine. And then there were the other groups like the Parabalani, a Christian brotherhood, essentially a kind of bodyguard for the Patriarch, also travelling around the city and Egypt, destroying pagan temples and shrines or converting them into churches. So in essence, the Christians during the 4th century quickly developed an upper hand with the Christian authorities behind them and the influential patriarchs of the city leading the fight against paganism, and this meant the city rapidly became a hotbed of Christianity. So this increasing intolerance climaxed in 391 AD, just 30 years after Julian's death, when Christians under the Patriarch Theophilus attacked the Serapeum, the most important pagan temple in the city and in Egypt, destroying not just a temple but the associated library of the temple as well, which held one of the most comprehensive archives of books in the Roman world. Socrates Scholasticus describes the actions of the Alexandrian Christians headed by Theophilus. Quote, seizing this opportunity, Theophilus exerted himself to the utmost. He caused the Mithraeum to be cleansed out. Then he destroyed the Serapeum, and he had the Phalli of Priapus carried through the midst of the forum. The heathen temples were therefore razed to the ground, and the images of their gods molten into pots, and other convenient utensils for the use of the Alexandrian Church. And perhaps the most famous incidents of violence in Alexandria after the attack on the Serapeum was the brutal killing by a Christian mob of Hypatia, one of the last of the pagan philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers of late antiquity in 415 CE. John of Nikiu, the 7th century chronicler, records the event and mentions in his narrative the mob hailing the Patriarch Cyril, who was Theophilus' nephew and successor, as, quote, the new Theophilus, for he had destroyed the last remains of idolatry in the city. And these two incidents could be said to mark quite dramatically the end of the pagan era of the city and the triumph of Christianity. And in the same year as Hypatia's death, the Jewish population would also be expelled from the city. So by the second decade of the 5th century, Alexandria was to all intents and purposes a Christian stronghold with pretty much all evidence of pagan and Jewish history wiped out. So enough about the background. Let's return to the Emperor Julian, who actually would not live to see these dramatic events, but who in his lifetime could see the zealotry growing amongst the Alexandrian Christians. Julian had been brought up as a Christian, but preferred Hellenic beliefs and philosophy, and abandoned Christianity publicly soon after he became emperor. He didn't persecute Christians, but he did try and reduce the privileges that Christianity had accrued from the time of Constantine onwards, around 50 years earlier. And that meant taking action like reducing the taxes exempt status of churches and other Christian organizations. Julian would also forbid Christian teachers from teaching classical texts, for instance. No allegiance to the gods mentioned in the classics of Homer, for instance. Considering Jewish mythology of the Bible instead as their spiritual source and inspiration rather than the ancient Greek heroes and the wisdom of the Greek philosophers. Rather, Christians thought of the Greek gods as demons in disguise and showed disgust towards them. I think it is absurd that men who expound the work of these writers should dishonour the gods whom they used to honour, Julian would write on his banning of Christians in the teaching profession. And he considered these works by Homer far more valuable and inspiring, moving and well written than the more crude and plain language used in the Bible. So this was an attempt by the emperor to reduce the influence the Christians had in schools and on pupils of an impressionable age, and he also began the restoration of various pagan temples and tried to reform pagan religion to make it better able to withstand Christian expansion. His admiration was more for predecessors like the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian, for example, and above all Alexander the Great, who he thought were much better examples of humanity, human energy and industry and dynamism than Christ. In a letter to the philosopher Maximus written earlier, he mentions Plutarch writing that Alexander used to sleep with Homer's poems under his pillow in order that by night as well as by day he might busy himself with his martial writings. And anecdotes like these reveal his admiration for both Homer and Alexander the Great. And in some of his letters that still survive to the people of the city, he castigates them for their desertion of the Greco-Roman beliefs that brought them so much success in contrast to the Christian cult. Julian's love of Hellenic culture showed in his hopes for the end of Christianity and the return of traditional Greco-Roman culture and values. In one of his works, he writes a hymn to the goddess Cybele asking for the return of pre-Christian times. Quote, "Grant to the Roman people in general that they may cleanse themselves of this stain of impiety," meaning Christianity. "Grant them a blessed lot and help them to guide their empire for many thousands of years." Unfortunately for Julian, he would reign only for a short time, dying in the east in the war against the Persians, and so his reforms and his counterattacks against Christianity never had a chance to come to fruition. On the specific matter of Christianity in Alexandria, Julian seems to have been fully conversant with the turbulent situation in the city. He would criticize the Christians of the city for deserting not only both the faith and religion of their forefathers and Hellenic philosophy in general, but also the spirit and philosophy of their illustrious founder of their city, Alexander the Great. And he reminds the people of this heritage and hinting that they should take their inspiration from his efforts rather than the Christian religion. Quote, "If you do not revere the memory of Alexander, your founder, and yet more than him, the great god, the most holy Serapis, how is it that you took no thought at least for the welfare of your community, for humanity, for decency?" And in this letter, he also mentions that the Serapeum had already been plundered once on the orders of the Christian authorities, stripping it of many of its statues and ornaments, although the statue of the god Serapis had, it seems, not been touched. And he sympathizes with the pagans in their attempts to defend the temple. And in another letter, he launches another attack on the Christians for their desertion of traditional beliefs. Quote, "I am overwhelmed with shame, I affirm it by the gods, O men of Alexandria, to think that even a single Alexandrian can admit that he is a Galilean." Julian would much prefer using the term Galilean to refer to the followers of Christianity, but would also refer to them sometimes as atheists as well. Anyway, let's take a look at his frustration at the people of Alexandria and what he wrote to them. Julian is writing primarily on the issue of Athanasius, who the Christians wanted back in the city as their patriarch, but who had been exiled by Constantius, the previous emperor. Julian doesn't want him back either, however, and in this preamble, Julian condemns the Christians for their wholesale rejection of their beliefs and rituals of their own founder, Jesus. Quote, "If your founder had been one of the Galileans, men who have transgressed their own law and have paid the penalties they deserved, since they elected to live in defiance of the law and have introduced a new doctrine and newfangled teaching, even then it would have been unreasonable for you to demand back Athanasius." By men who have transgressed their own law, Julian means Christians discarding the laws of Moses and written in detail in the Jewish scriptures and which would form the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. And these laws were never designed to be rejected. The Old Testament never specifies anywhere that the appearance of a Jewish Messiah to liberate his people from foreign dominance would signal the end of the Mosaic laws. And nor did Jesus, even if we assume that he was a Jewish Messiah, reject these laws or order them to be rescinded after his death by his followers. These were, after all, the pillars of Judaism, which Jesus followed till his death and were certainly meant to be obeyed for all time. The Christians, though, had arbitrarily, after his death, decided to jettison these laws simply to be able to better appeal to the pagans and make more converts. So Julian scores an important point here as the Christians of the 4th century moved further and further away from the Jewish roots of Jesus and the Judaism that he himself practiced. Julian then reminds the Alexandrians of their military prowess, derived as it was from the armies of Alexander. They were, he said, conquerors of not just Egypt but Palestine, but importantly they were masters of the Jews. Quote, "The forefathers of the genuine Hebrews were the slaves of the Egyptians long ago, but in these days, men of Alexandria, you have conquered the Egyptians, for your founder was a conqueror of Egypt. Submit yourself, despite your sacred traditions, in willing slavery to men who have set at naught the teachings of their ancestors." So the Alexandrians had willingly accepted a spiritual slavery, if you like, towards Christianity, a belief derived from Judaism, but worst of all, it was a slavery to a belief that was essentially a corruption of Judaism and which had blatantly rejected much of the customs, beliefs, and principles of its parent belief. And he reminds them of the glory days of Alexandria, when the city was pagan, and compares it to the current period when Alexandria, although still important, was no longer the premier city of the Mediterranean. Quote, "You have then no recollection of those happy days of old when all Egypt held communion with the gods, and we enjoyed many benefits therefrom. But those who have but yesterday introduced among you this new doctrine, tell me of what benefit have they been to the city?" It was the Ptolemies, he wrote, that due to their genius had increased the importance of the city, but made it what it was before the arrival of Christianity. So in what way could the city possibly have any gratitude to this new belief? Quote, "Your founder was a God-fearing man, Alexander of Macedon, and in no way by Zeus like any of these persons, nor again did he resemble any Hebrews, although the latter have shown themselves far superior to the Galileans. Nay, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, proved stronger than the Jews, while Alexander, if he had to match himself with the Romans, would have made even them fight hard for supremacy. And what about the Ptolemies who succeeded your founder and nurtured your city from her earliest years as though she was their own daughter? And it was certainly not by the preachings of Jesus that they increased her renown, nor by the teachings of the Galileans, detested of the gods, did they perfect this administration which she enjoys and to which she owes her present good fortune." Julian also mentions that Augustus, when he visited the city, showed great reverence for the god Serapis and for the city being founded as it was by Alexander the Great. And then he mentions, perhaps alluding to the biblical scriptures, mentioning that the Jews are the chosen race, that the gods, in contrast to the Christian and Jewish beliefs, do not believe in a chosen race or chosen people, but that the divine being considers all men equal wherever they live and whoever they are. These then, to sum them up briefly, are the blessings bestowed by the Olympian gods on your city in peculiar, though I pass over very many because they would take too long to describe. But the blessings that are vouchsafed by the visible gods to all in common every day, not merely to a few persons or a single race or to one city, but to the whole world at the same time, how can you fail to know what they are? Julian then attacks them for their faith in a person being divine whom they've never seen or come face to face with, something that required such a large leap of faith and without sufficient evidence of any kind. Quote, "Yet you have the audacity not to adore any one of these gods, and you think that one whom neither you nor your fathers have ever seen, even Jesus, ought to rank as God the world." And finally, he would urge the Christian Alexandrians to reject Christianity like he did at the age of 20 and follow his example and return to the original beliefs in the Greek gods. Quote, "If you heed my admonition, do ye lead yourselves even a little towards the truth, for you will not stray from the right road if you heed one who till his 20th year walked in that road of yours, but for 12 years now has walked in the road I speak of by the grace of the gods. Julian would, as mentioned earlier, be killed in the war against Persia and therefore wouldn't see paganism being extinguished in the city within a few decades after his death. And for the few pagan philosophers and other thinkers of pagan persuasion that were left by the first few decades of the 5th century, Alexandria had become a dangerous place to stay. So the historian Will Durant would explain, quote, pagan professors of philosophy after the death of Hypatia sought security in Athens where non-Christian teaching was still relatively and innocuously free. Student life was still lively there and enjoyed most of the consolations of higher education, fraternities, distinctive garbs, hazing, and a general hilarity. But Durant was only partly right, however, as it wouldn't be long before the Platonic school in Athens, the last refuge for pagan philosophy, would be closed in 529 AD on the orders of the Emperor Justinian, and finally bringing an end to pagan teaching and learning in the Roman Empire. But the Christian assault on paganism in Alexandria and in Egypt in general turned out to be pretty academic in the end. Byzantine rule over Egypt would only last for another 250 years, for in the year 639, around 300 years after Julian, Muslim armies invaded Egypt and Alexandria was captured by Muslim forces in September 641 CE, and that signalled the end of Christian domination over the city and in fact North Africa shortly afterwards. And in many senses, Christianity now faced the same pressure from Islam and the relegation to second-class status that it had meted out itself to paganism earlier. One of the few sources we have that was written close to the time of the conquest of the city by Arab forces was by John, the Bishop of Nikiu, and we know from him that the Islamic tax on non-Muslims, called the jizya, was introduced on Christians by the Caliph Umar. John of Nikiu writes that taxes on the Egyptians were a considerable burden on the Christians. Quote, and the yoke they laid on the Egyptians was heavier than the yoke which had been laid on Israel by Pharaoh, to the extent of 22 batter of gold, till all the people hid themselves owing to the greatness of the tribulation and could not find the wherewithal to pay. And these financial penalties were severe to the point that it became difficult for the Christians of Egypt to meet the demands of the Muslim authorities. But the Alexandrians, John wrote, were particularly hard hit by the change of rulers. Quote, and none could recount the mourning and lamentation which took place in that city. They even gave away their children in exchange for the great sums which they had to pay monthly, and they had none to help them, and God destroyed their hopes and delivered the Christians into the hands of their enemies. So in many senses, Julian was right in that the glory days that the city had had during its pagan era were definitely gone, and the city would no longer be considered one of the great metropolises of the Mediterranean. Finally, if you'd like to read more on the subject of Julian and on up to the destruction of the Serapeum and the death of Hypatia, there are a number of contemporary or near-contemporary accounts as referred to and used for writing on the subject, and I've highlighted them below in the description. And if you ever visit Alexandria, you can still see what remains of the Serapeum, although the bulk of the structure above ground was completely destroyed and a Christian church was built over the demolished temple. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hope you liked this video, and if you did, consider liking, subscribing, and checking out the other videos on this channel as well.